We are Daily News. You can support us with the super thanks button below. The global effects of the war between Ukraine and Russia currently continue to seriously affect overseas areas. The mobility created in the navies of Russia and its ally China in the Pacific increase the tension day by day. The most critical point in this marine area is the South China Sea. The South China Sea is a coastal sea in the west of the Pacific Ocean, where the lands of Southeast Asia meet the ocean. This area has been the subject of sovereignty disputes since the riparian countries gained their independence after the Second World War, especially in this critical period when the war in Eastern Europe is heating up. The South China Sea has also alarmed the powerful NATO Navy. The U.S. Pacific Navy is currently in the South China Sea because of the colossal threats China is trying to create. USS Milius sailed near the South China Sea island, militarized by China. The operation of the U.S. Navy destroyer took place as the Chinese Army demonstrated its strength around Taiwan. For the third time in a row, tensions in the region had escalated in recent days as 42 Chinese aircraft and 8 warships crossed the Taiwan Strait. As Beijing appears to be increasing the pressure on Taipei, Taiwan said it has detected 42 Chinese aircraft near its borders. Among the Chinese warplanes were the Shenyang J-10, J-11, and J-16. 29 of the aircraft crossed the center line of Taiwan Strait and entered the Air Defense Identification Zone (ADIZ) in the southwest of the country. Taiwanese military officials also said that 8 Chinese warships have been spotted near its territorial waters. The line is an unofficial dividing line between the territories of China and Taiwan. Jets and Navy ships took part in 3-day military exercises that were meant to be a dry rehearsal of the island state's encirclement. In this process, the Taiwan Navy was also alarmed. At the same time, the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet was monitoring the situation close to the region. The exercises began hours after Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen returned from a trip to the United States. The USS Milius operation in the South China Sea was in response to a brief visit by the Taiwanese president to the United States. Currently, it's known that the ship is still on its critical course in this regard. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet made a statement stating that the guided missile destroyer USS Milius was most recently sailing in international waters 12 nautical miles from the Mischief Reef in the Spratly Islands, known as China's Non-Shore Islands. The Mischief Reef area, located within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, is claimed by Vietnam and Taiwan. Both countries claim rights for this region. Beijing fortified this island and built military facilities to maintain regional control. But features like Mischief Reef, which in their naturally occurring state are flooded at high tide, do not qualify for territorial waters. In addition, the land reclamation works facilities and structures built on Mischief Reef do not change this characterization under international law. On the other hand, the Chinese Army stated that the U.S. ship illegally approached the waters near the reef without the permission of the Beijing government, and its personnel observed and warned of it. China's Southern Command, after this striking statement, reported that the South China Sea islands and the surrounding maritime region are fully under Chinese control. Beijing claims sovereignty over 80% of the South China Sea. Other parties in this regard are the Philippines, Taiwan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Brunei. Despite the fact that the U.S. ship USS Milius was in the South China Sea, an operational response came from the Beijing government. In addition to these statements, as tension escalated, the Chinese military reported that it conducted 3-day military exercises around Taiwan. Meanwhile, the Chinese military conducted air and naval blockade operations near Taiwan on the last day of the scheduled exercises. During these exercises, a Chinese carrier participated in combat patrols. According to Chinese state television, military exercises around Taiwan involved various types of aircraft, including nuclear-capable H-6 bombers armed with live missiles. In addition, Japan's defense ministry reported that Shandong, a Chinese aircraft carrier, is conducting air operations near Japan's Okinawa Islands. The carrier was accompanied by 3 other warships and a support ship. Japan closely followed China's military exercises around Taiwan with great interest. Japan has also expressed concerns over China's military operations in the region, mainly due to the proximity of the southern Japanese islands to Taiwan. It was observed that the jet fighters and helicopters of the Chinese army made a total of 120 takeoffs and landings on the aircraft carrier. In fact, these exercises were initiated in response to Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen's meeting with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and other lawmakers. The Seventh Fleet statement declared that the free movement operation of the U.S. destroyer supports the rights of other countries to send ships to the region. In fact, American warships in the South China Sea routinely conducted these FONUPs. It was the second time in 3 weeks that these FONUPs had been conducted by Milius, sailing near the Paracel Islands, known as the Shisha Islands in China, north of the South China Sea. In addition, the United States stated that its Navy and Air Forces will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows, regardless of the location of the extreme sea claims and current events. Tan Kefei, spokesman for the Chinese Ministry of Defense, claimed that after the FONUP in March, the U.S. violated Beijing's sovereignty while undermining peace and stability in the South China Sea. The United States, on the other hand, coincided with this FONUP on the third day of Chinese forces' large-scale military exercises around the island of Taiwan. Meanwhile, Beijing launched operations around Taiwan a day after Taiwan's President Tsai Ing-wen returned from a 10-day visit to Central America and the United States, where he met with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Beijing has repeatedly warned against Xi's meeting with McCarthy and has previously threatened to take strong and decisive action if the meeting continues. But since these threatening approaches of China only constantly escalating tensions in the island region, the U.S. now had to show China that it could protect Taiwan. This situation will require much longer efforts than ever before for the United States because the USA provided serious military and financial support to the Ukrainian army due to the war between Ukraine and Russia. For this reason, Washington, which has to limit its expenditures on its own defense industry to a certain extent, must act in a very planned manner regarding China. However, there is no obstacle for the U.S. to proceed on the desired route in the South China Sea and to act in accordance with the international maritime norms. When we look at the current position in terms of naval power, we can see that the USA is much more advantageous than China, especially with the number of submarines and other amphibious ships. The USA does not seem to listen to the Chinese threat in the South China Sea. On the other hand, before the crisis in this global area escalates much, the United States must continue to take steps to solve this problem. This is because, with each passing day, the danger and anxiety on this issue increases with its statements. The Beijing government emphasizes that it owns every region in the South China Sea in order to restrict the navigation of ships coming from the Philippines and Vietnam and to stop their legal commercial activities. In addition, the Beijing government, Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, and Vietnam recognize the Spratlys as part of their territory. In this regard, the United States of America supports freedom of navigation for all nations in principle, as long as some countries continue to claim and assert rights beyond their jurisdiction under international law. The United States will continue to defend the rights and freedoms of the sea guaranteed to all. The U.S. Navy said in a statement that no member of the international community should be intimidated or forced to give up their rights and freedoms. In addition, the United States has also signed diplomatic steps to reduce the emerging tension. Chris Meagher, the Pentagon's Deputy Defense Secretary for Public Affairs, told reporters that Beijing should not turn the Taiwanese leader's visit to California into an excuse to overreact. We know that the United States continues to keep the channels of communication open with the People's Republic of China open. But so far, Beijing has rejected requests to meet with both Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Chief of Staff General Mark Milley. In short, While China is trying to create a global crisis, the USA is trying to establish a new order for the whole world without the threats of China by using both its navy and diplomacy. Dear Russian soldiers, do you want to live? The war between Ukraine and Russia has affected these two countries as well as the whole of Europe and even the whole world, economically, militarily, and politically. Almost all the states of the world turned against Russia. Countries in the geography with Russia especially increased their defense expenditures and started to allocate funds for the Ukrainian army. Ukraine, on the other hand, continues to drive the Russians out of its country, knowing that almost the whole world is behind it. And as if to thank its army for the modern weapons donated, the clashes between the two countries are concentrated in eastern and southern Ukraine. Conflicts in the east have intensified in and around Bakhmut in recent months. The defense structures of the Russian troops stationed here were on the verge of collapse with the successful HIMARS attacks of the Ukrainian artillery. The Russian troops there have mostly fled to the hilly parts of Bakhmut, and their fire on the Ukrainian troops is hardly effective. The Ukrainian army, which also blocked the supply routes of the Russian troops stationed in the east, officially left the Russians hungry, thirsty, and unarmed. Winter is still not over in Ukraine, and the Russian soldiers are struggling with the harsh winter. On the one hand, trying to keep their psychology intact on the one hand and trying not to be cannon fodder for the Ukrainian artillery on the southern front. The Ukrainian army has completely taken over the city of Kherson. The few Russian attacks from the left bank of the Dnipro are successfully thwarted. The attacks of the Ukrainian air forces, especially from Kherson to the Crimean side and the Russian Black Sea Fleet stationed in Sevastopol, continue without slowing down. The Ukrainian Air Force has reduced the Russian presence in the Black Sea to 7 ships. Russian air defense systems deployed over Crimea are also systematically hit. Earlier this week, experts warned the Russian military that Ukraine could launch a possible airborne operation on the left bank of the Dnipro if this attack takes place. As experts claim, the Ukrainian army will move a little closer to its ultimate target, the Crimea. Apart from these, desertions continue within the Russian army. Some of the 300,000 Russian youth recruited by the partial mobilization decision announced in the autumn were sent to Ukraine. But almost every day, 300 to 500 mobilized soldiers are eliminated by the Ukrainian army as the commanders keep the mobilized soldiers on the front line. The vast majority of those who remain either lay down their weapons and surrender to the Ukrainian army or flee from the front. So what did Ukraine do for deserters in the Russian army? Today, we will give you information and details about the answer to this question. The Ukrainian government has signed a project that will go down in history after the partial mobilization decision of Russian President Vladimir Putin. I Want to Live was launched as a Ukrainian state project designed to help Russian military personnel surrender safely. The aim is to ensure that the Russian soldiers fleeing their units are safely removed from the Ukrainian borders and reunited with their families. At this point, it is seen that the I Want to Live project has been carried on with success. A total of 9,836 people from the temporarily occupied regions of Russia and Ukraine applied to the I Want to Live project for the Russians who are ready to surrender. During the 6 months of the project, more than 14 million people, 84% of whom were users, visited that I Want to Live website. Despite regular attempts by the Russian Federal Service for Communications, Information Technology, and Mass Media Supervision to block access to the project, relatives and loved ones of the soldiers other than Russian soldiers applied to the phone line. Most of the time mobilized, Russians do not have access to the internet or mobile communication when they arrive in Ukraine, so their families use the I Want to Live line instead. So how well did the I Want to Live project work? Set up 6 days before Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the mobilization of 300,000 reservists, that I Want to Live hotline received 6,543 calls from Russian personnel in 1 week. It was stated that those contacted through the service were verified as Russian soldiers using personal data and service number. The call center, which is managed by 10 operators, is said to have been relocated to a secret location to avoid Moscow interference during a busy call flow. Fears that Putin will announce a second mobilization for his special military operation still remain. The 24/7 hotline receives between 50 and 100 calls per day, and messages are also sent to the service's Telegram channel. The call center was moved from the division's Kiev offices to a secret location a month ago for fear of being the target of Russian attacks. Officials of the project declined to comment on the number of deliveries completed, but described the service as a complete success. In the first stage, the mobilized, partially mobilized, and not yet mobilized Russian soldiers should call this helpline and say "I am leaving" and surrender. After that, soldiers are obliged to leave their personal data. The soldier has to call back and say "I will surrender" after reaching Ukrainian soil, and Ukrainian operators are helping the surrendered soldiers reach a safe place where they will encounter Ukrainian special forces. A few months ago, it was reported that there were soldiers begging to get out of the mess in Kherson during the extensive Ukrainian counteroffensive. The call center received calls from the Russians, and the Russian soldiers said to them, "Save our souls because we got stuck in the mud. Our battalion fell completely. We have 10 soldiers left. Please get us out of this mess." One of the call center employees said the volume and content of calls gave him hope that Russia's resolve was weakening. Some people call and say, "I'm somewhere in the army. I want to surrender." Others say, "I'm afraid to mobilize in Russia. What should I do?" Others say, "I am on Ukrainian soil. I want to surrender." They are afraid and do not know what to do. So what happens to the Russian soldiers who surrendered to the Ukrainians? Those who surrender are offered the opportunity to be part of a prisoner exchange for Ukrainian soldiers captured by the Russians as part of such exchanges. A total of 1646 Ukrainian personnel were reportedly released by the Russian government, with the most recent of which 50 were exchanged from both sides. It is not standard policy to report the number of Russian soldiers returned in prisoner exchanges, but the freed Russian prisoners were given the personal want to live business cards, but also had the option that if they were redeployed to the battlefield, which is not uncommon, they could surrender again by telling the operator the number on the card. Many of the Russian soldiers currently in Ukraine are uneducated and unarmed Russian youth who were recruited by the partial mobilization decision announced in the autumn. As such, that "I want to live" line established by Ukraine saves the lives of many young people and strives to bring them back to real life. So what other projects does the Ukrainian government produce for Russian soldiers who want to surrender? Tens of thousands of drones have been deployed across Ukraine to destroy Russian elements, spy on their formations, and direct bombs at their targets. But last month, the Ukrainian military launched a program to use UAVs in a more unconventional role, guiding Russian soldiers who want to surrender. The basis of the program is that in late November, the Ukrainian army tensely followed a path marked by a drone where a Russian soldier threw his gun to the ground, raised his hands, and delivered it to the 54th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Army. A few weeks later, the Ukrainian General Staff released a training video explaining how Russian soldiers could surrender to a Ukrainian drone. And this is now part of Ukraine's far-reaching effort to persuade Russian soldiers to give up. It is too early to know whether the drone effort will attract meaningful numbers of Russian deserters, but this adds another way for Ukraine to recruit Russian deserters, adding a distinctly modern twist to the age-old information warfare tactic, and could at least erode Russian morale on the battlefield. Russia's defeats have already provided an opportunity for Ukraine to exploit this low morale, especially after the Kremlin sent thousands of new troops into fierce battles with little training and insufficient supplies in the fall. The fact that so many desertions from the Russian army are the biggest proof that there are great problems in the army and that the mobilized soldiers are not comfortable in the army. Isn't it delusional to hope that the Russian army will gain any war in such an environment? It is difficult to predict what the coming days will show us about the Ukraine war, but it seems that the Russian army will not be able to continue this war any longer as long as it suffers such losses. The most intense fights took place in the east here. Due to the recent snowfall and rain, all clashes moved from the fields to the city. Russians took advantage of the increased availability of artillery and focused their fire on the central part of the city. However, such abusive artillery put a stick in the will of the Russian assault units because all it led to was the creation of a pile of rubble that separated Ukrainian and Russian positions. Last time I told you that Russian forces secured new gains in the central part of the region and started expanding outwards. I also told you that whenever Ukrainians are forced to step back, they try to make sure to mine and blow up important buildings to prevent the Russians from improving their tactical position. Yesterday night, the head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, announced that they had successfully reached another street in the central part of the region, established total control over the city hall, and raised Russian and Wagner flags on top of it. Later, it was revealed that the city hall was completely demolished and the Russian flag was stuck in the pile of rubble. For now, it is not known whether it was destroyed by an explosion or artillery or other means. It is possible that due to heavy fighting, the devils did not withstand the fire and collapsed, and the fights in the central part of the city are incredibly heavy. Wagner forces have to deal with battles for each house in their way, and each building is a well-fortified position because Ukrainians started digging trenches on the main streets already in December. The head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin, said that the tempo of advance is slow because each window is a potential firing point and a machine gun nest which Ukrainians can assume and use at any time. But Ukrainians also receive heavy fire. That is why all streets are covered in debris due to the constant use of artillery by Russians. Whenever Ukrainians get out of cover, they are always running even when they are not in the combat zone. The recent deterioration of weather conditions actually helped Russians a lot since infantry fights became almost impossible on the fields. All Russian artillery in the region could concentrate their fire just on Bakhmut with an increased rate of shelling. The useful life of buildings that Ukrainians are using for cover rapidly shortened. This is the main factor that contributed to recent Russian gains in the central part of the city. In the southern part, the Ukrainian 83rd Mechanized Brigade still continues to hold the line. Recent footage shows that they are in active defense and tried to counterattack Russian positions whenever possible. Today, drone operators from the 93rd Mechanized Brigade helped to eliminate yet another Russian squad that tried to hide in the house on the outskirts. The continuous high level of coordination between drone and artillery crews has already resulted in elimination of hundreds, if not thousands, of Russian assault men. Only in the southern suburbs because they have been releasing new footage of such operations every day for an extended period of time. In the northern part of the city, the most intense fights are taking place on the territory of the industrial area. Recently released footage indicates that the fights are taking place in the workshops located on the facade of Pavolik. The footage also perfectly displays why moving from one workshop to another is such a difficult task, and why the attackers usually sustain much higher losses than the defenders. Ukrainian fighters from the 1st Border Detachment made holes between the concrete wall plates to throw grenades through them and fire with guns and even RPGs. Overall, the change in weather conditions fostered rapid intensification of fights inside the city because it is the only place where they could continue. The altered setting allowed Russians to focus artillery fire on one place instead of numerous targets along the flanks, and a focused fire started destroying houses much more rapidly. Nonetheless, Ukrainians are keeping the northern and southern front lines very stable. The limited gains that Russian forces managed to secure by totally demolishing the area may actually become their biggest handicap as they reduce the houses in front of them to marble. It became an additional obstacle in the way of the assault units rather than a useful position where they could hide. What do you think about this? As Daily News team, we will continue to closely follow the developments in Russia and bring you the latest news. Our team spends a great deal of effort to prepare these news. You can support our team for the development of independent journalism. For this, you can use the super thanks button below the video. We also carefully read your comments on our news. We would like to know what you think about this incident. What do you think was the purpose of this attack? What do you think about the explosions in Russia, and how do you think this will affect the course of the war? Share your thoughts with us. Follow us for more updates.